Devotee's mad.
That one morning, as Prabhupada used to circumambulate the deities and ring the bell, and the big kirtan party would go around, the whole mood was pretty ecstatic that particular morning. I don't know who was leading kirtan or what, but Prabhupada was very blissful. He'd go around, he'd ring the bell with the kirtan, bong, 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 and the kids were dancing like mad out in front, and then he'd go around and he'd ring the next bell, and then he'd come around in front of the deities. So I said, geez, I'm not going to fight these crowds. So I'm going to wait right here by this pillar in front of the deities, and then when Prabhupada comes around, then I'll be there to see him. And so sure enough, here comes Prabhupada around, and Brahmananda's there. And so Prabhupada stops in front of the deities, and he starts looking at the deities a little bit. And then he folds his hands in obeisances and does a 360, turns around, and the kirtan's going and going, and then finally Prabhupada all of a sudden lifts his arms up and starts dancing. And everybody just kind of went through the roof at that time. Very similar to that Rath Yatra when Prabhupada got up off the Vyasasana and started to dance, and everybody just went wild. I remember seeing a reflection off of Brahmananda, some kind of, just golden reflection that must have been Prabhupada. But it's amazing how just seeing Prabhupada was so enlivening, so special.
From where I was sitting, I used to see Prabhupada, and they would put chandan on his head. He would all go kind of white, his forehead, and he was sitting, and he was such a, an aristocratic person. I just couldn't picture or think of what kind of person he was. He looked so, like a king, like a very aristocratic person. I just couldn't put it in words. And then one time one devotee came up to me and said, you know what I've just read? He said that the spiritual master is the sum total of all the demigods. I said, wow, yeah. That's exactly how I'm seeing Prabhupada. That fits his description, like he's competent to, as a pure devotee of Krishna, he's competent to be in the position of preaching to everyone, even demigods. He is the sum total of all the demigods. And the devotees, they were offered chamras to Prabhupada, and those chamras would change colour. They would be multicolored. They would be red, blue, yellows, as they were going up and down. And where I was sitting, from my angle vision, I could see that many, many times, many days, not only one time. And even I asked another devotee one time, I said, can you see what I'm seeing? Is the chamra changing colour? And we were looking, he said, yeah, it is. They would actually be multicolored. I don't know if it's some trick of light or anything, but anyway, somehow or another, those chamras were changing colors.
After we constructed the Lotus building, Srila Prabhupada became aware that the devotees were very much disturbed by all the excessive cinema music that was coming from over in Navadvip and from Swarupganj. And they had their ghetto blasters over there, their big, huge loudspeakers, and it was driving us all crazy. It was really disturbing us. So Jayapataka Maharaj and Bhavananda mentioned this to Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada said, blast them back. You should blast them back. So Jayapataka Maharaj and Bhavananda put these huge big speakers on each corner of the Lotus building. Massive big things. And we played Prabhupada's bhajans and our own kirtans. And we really blasted them. So, because it's better that we listen to our music than their music. If we're going to get blasted, we may as well get blasted by our own music rather than get blasted by all their cinema music, mundane stuff. So they started to respect the fact that we were here then, and I think some kind of a truce came up. But there was a big sound war going on there in the early days.
During the day, we would go on parikrams. Chutananda Swami was leading the parikram on each place and explaining about the importance of all of the holy places in Mayapur. And we would all come down Bhaktisiddhanta Road to the various spots and temples. For most of us, this was our first visit to India, certainly my first visit. I remember some devotees telling me, this is the dust that Lord Chaitanya walked on. This is Chintamani. This is non-different from the spiritual world. And that realization was unique to all of us. Prabhupada was always the center of the festival. We all came to India to see Prabhupada. Prabhupada wanted us all to come to Mayapur every year. He felt it was very important for us, as this was the birthplace of the Hare Krishna movement. The managers were very concerned that we didn't spend too much time in India because they wanted us to come back and do Sankirtan and run the temples and preach in the West. The idea was to come to India and to get recharged and enlivened and go back and preach in the West.
I went into Prabhupada's room and I wanted to personally say to Srila Prabhupada, thank you for bringing us to Mayapur. So in the darshan, we're all sitting there listening, and when it was over, everybody offered their obeisances. So I stayed down on the floor longer and offered my obeisances very, very slowly, so that when I stood up, pretty much everybody was out of the room. So I walked forward to Prabhupada, sitting at his desk, and he was going to drink some water, and I stepped forward and I said, Srila Prabhupada? And he was just about to drink, and he said, yes. And I said, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you for bringing us all here to Mayapur. And Prabhupada sipped a little water, and he said, oh, I have not brought you. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and my Guru Maharaj, they have brought you. He said, Mayapur, Vrindavan, this is your home. The West, that is for preaching. And he drank some water. And when he stopped drinking the water, he looked back at me, he smiled, he said, or for sense gratification. He said, so you come every year, take inspiration here in the Holy Dham, and then go back to the West and preach vigorously, and then come back again and take inspiration.
One day on the veranda outside his room at Mayapur, Prabhupada was saying to us, you have all been sent by Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur to help me in spreading this mission. And I said, Srila Prabhupada, how can that be? I said, we were born into the most low kinds of families, raised on meat and all sorts of abominable things. How could we have been sent by Bhakti Siddhanta Thakur? And Prabhupada looked at me and he said, that was only superficial. When you heard the holy name, you immediately came running.
In Los Angeles, Srila Prabhupada had told us that we should come to the Mayapur festival to perform 5 Krishna Lila and 5 Chaitanya Lila. And we were to collect as much as we could individually to pay for the trip, and whatever we couldn't collect, he would pay from his trust. So we rehearsed every day. Then we got to Mayapur. We performed, I don't remember how many performances, maybe 3. And there was some complaint from the sannyasis of having women performing. I think Sadarupa was playing Krishna. So there was a little bit of upset, and the performances were stopped. We didn't know quite what to make of that. It was a very difficult period because we thought, why doesn't Prabhupada just tell them that we're doing it anyway? Most of us just accepted it. But there was one of the members that had a really hard time accepting that and ended up leaving. One thing that I had learned up to that point, that sometimes Srila Prabhupada would make a decision that I couldn't understand. And I learned that the best thing to do is just to think, well, I don't understand it now, but maybe in the future I'll understand it. So just to be able to understand the fact that I don't know everything. With my rebellious nature, it was tough, but I did it.
Prabhupada was speaking in the Bhagavatam class one morning. And at a certain point in the lecture, he went into just a kind of ecstatic trance. He was clearly very alert. It wasn't that he appeared in any way to be dozing. His eyes were just closed. and he appeared to be ruminating very deeply. But he was silent for a long time. And everybody in the temple room was dead silent. It was a very, very poignant moment where everyone was in utter state of attention and nothing was being said. Everybody was just waiting for Prabhupada to do something. And nobody dared make a sound. And after what seemed like much longer, but was probably a minute or two, Hansaduta started chanting Nama Om Vishnu Padaya, and just sort of broke the moment. And Prabhupada kind of shook his head and indicated to go on chanting.
So then Prabhupada went up to his room, and then this big argument started, downstairs and outside Prabhupada's quarters with the different devotees. They were all speculating on what the proper etiquette was when your spiritual master goes into ecstasy on the Vyasa-san. Some devotees were saying we should have just sat there and waited for him to open his eyes again, and others said no, you should chant Hare Krishna. Chanting Hare Krishna is always proper. So anyway, it went on, and disagreement was there. So then we just had Prabhupada. You would just go to Prabhupada and ask him. So you could always get the final answer. We could fight, and no one would ever agree. So anyway, Brahmananda was his secretary at the time. So we went into Prabhupada's room, and he said, Prabhupada, downstairs this morning when you went into ecstasy on the Vyasa-san? And Prabhupada just looking, and he said, well, we were wondering what's the proper thing to do when you do that. And Prabhupada got just shy and humble and said, I don't do that very often. He said, no, Prabhupada, it's all right. But when you do it, he said, what should we do? Should we just sit there and wait for you? Or should we start kirtan? Should we start chanting? And Prabhupada said, you can chant Hare Krishna. And that was it. So, but we were so silly, It would have been nice just to sit there, even if it was an hour, it would have been wonderful. Because when Prabhupada went into ecstasy, you couldn't help but, on some level, feel ecstatic symptoms yourself. Just knowing Prabhupada was in ecstasy like that, had gone inward like that, was enough to make you feel some bliss. So sitting and watching was nice.
There was an incident with Siddha Swarup in Mayapur, and the devotees were reporting to Prabhupada about something that had happened. So Srila Prabhupada said words to the effect that, I consider that if he has come from so far away to see me, there must be some love there. And he said, Krishna's love is unconditional, that no matter what you do, still I love you. He said his love is like the father's love for the son. No matter what the son does, the father always loves him. So Prabhupada is was always accepting and always willing to forgive. That was a unique quality about Srila Prabhupada, that he had no animosity or enmity towards anyone at all.
Prabhupada was walking down the road from the Lotus building to the front gate, and we had planted some banana trees, and one of the banana trees was turning yellow, and Prabhupada stopped and looked at it, and he looked at me and he said, when you are head of the ashram, you are responsible for feeding all the residents of the ashram. This tree needs water. He said, plants live on water, that's their food. So you are responsible not just for the human residents, but all the residents. He said, you make sure that this tree receives water.
I remember that every morning Srila Prabhupada was lecturing on the first 14 shlokas of the Chaitanya Charitamrita. And that first chapter and that first volume had just recently been released. So Srila Prabhupada was now lecturing so wonderfully on the mood and pastimes of Mahaprabhu and the Samkirtan movement. And I can remember on one occasion, on one day, he was saying that this Krishna consciousness movement, now we have just a few gurus, but in the future there will be hundreds of gurus, and then there will be thousands of gurus. And as he was declaring this, then all the devotees were cheering, all the hundreds of devotees there were cheering, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada. But those first 14 days in Mayapur with Srila Prabhupada, oh, it was such a opportunity that I can never forget.
In Mayapur, we never bought any flowers. We just used flowers for the deities and for Prabhupada's garland from the flowers in the garden. And we didn't pick them ahead of time, we just picked them that morning. The little girls who were 10 years old or so, there was like 3 or 4 of them, they'd go out right after Mangalarti, and even if it was dark, because in the wintertime it'd be dark after Mangalarti, and they would pick the flowers. And then they'd bring them back to the temple and they'd make the garlands. And Prabhupada's garland, they would really make a nice garland. It was thick and very long. You know, sometimes they made them down to Prabhupada's knees. It was kind of hard for him to walk with such a long garland. And one of their habits was that they would take the petals that were left over after making all the garlands for the deities and for Prabhupada, and they would sprinkle them on Prabhupada's shoes, which are right outside the doorway. So one day, the little girls told us ladies, be there when Prabhupada leaves the temple room. You're going to see something fun. So we were outside the door when Prabhupada came out, and a servant would always help Prabhupada on with his shoes. This particular day, he started walking, and the flower petals normally would fall off his shoes when he took a few steps, but they weren't going anywhere. And Prabhupada looked down at his foot and kind of shook it, one foot a little bit, and put that foot down. They picked up the other foot and shook it, and there were still flowers on his shoes. And the little girls were cracking up. They just thought it was so funny. They had actually made little garlands and tied them around the toe of Prabhupada's shoe. So then he started laughing too. I mean, it was just really comical. And Prabhupada was such a good sport. I mean, he had such a great sense of humor. So he just thought it was really funny that they played this innocent joke.
I remember one evening the Manipuri dancers came to perform in front of all the devotees and Srila Prabhupada. And this is perhaps even the very first time I think Swarup Damodar Maharaj had organized. And they were performing a kind of Ras Leela dance. Now Prabhupada was sitting and watching this in the temple room, and he was surrounded by many sannyasis, and of course there were many brahmacharis as well during that time. And we were watching this dance performance where there were very beautiful, decorated young ladies who were dancing and performing the Ras Leela dance, depicting the beautiful moods of the gopis. And Prabhupada gave a short talk after this. He was mentioning how Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, would never actually look. He was very, very strict. And especially he was very strict with his renunciate devotees, that they should not associate with the opposite sex. And I think Srila Prabhupada was making this point because he could understand and see that this was an unusual experience for a lot of the renunciate devotees who were there, and perhaps it was a bit of a test for them. So Prabhupada mentioned like this, and he said, but at the same time we appreciate very much, we're very thankful that these dancers have come, they're very, very good devotees of Krishna, and this tradition is a very old tradition in their country. They're very, very expert at depicting the Ras Leela dance of Radha and Krishna.
The Congress government was in power in West Bengal. I was very much interfacing with the VIPs, ministers and others, and the education minister, one Mrityunjay Banerjee, I invited him to Mayapur when Prabhupada was there. And I told Prabhupada just before I brought him in, I've brought the education minister of West Bengal and he's here. Can he come in and speak to you? Prabhupada said, yes, bring him in. And I brought him in and he kind of gave his shrug obeisances, and Prabhupada bade him to sit down right in front of his desk there in his room. And then I said, Srila Prabhupada, this is the Honorable Minister of Education for West Bengal. And then the man looked at Prabhupada, and then Prabhupada just looked at him and said nothing. To the point where I flinched. I was embarrassed. I thought maybe he didn't hear me. So I said, Srila Prabhupada, this is the Education Minister of West Bengal. And then Prabhupada, he looked at the man and he said, that is not education. And then I almost died. And then Prabhupada fell silent again. And then a few words were said, and then it was all over. I took him out. But Prabhupada, of course, gave a couple of qualifying sentences to say what is real education is understanding the difference between the body or matter and the soul, and explained a little to the fellow that this education should also be distributed. But sometimes Prabhupada just could pin a guy who he was, and it wasn't simply worth it to go beyond that point.
Srila Prabhupada wrote this book called Gita Gan, Bhagavad Gita. Srila Prabhupada wrote in Bengali poetry. It's a very nice book. And Prabhupada wanted the Gurukul boys to learn these verses and sing while we were walking to the temple in the line, especially morning time and evening time. And he wanted us to actually learn all the verses. And I was one of the boys that knew the whole Gita Gan by heart. So there was a time when my teachers arranged with Prabhupada that some of our boys sing this to him individually, chapter by chapter. So I studied very hard, and I was called in to sing to him one chapter. And I sang to him a whole chapter. There were some other boys as well, but individually we came. So that's one of the things that pleased Prabhupada very much. Because Prabhupada would always smile, and at the end he would give us a coconut laddu. His smile made us more happy, and the enthusiasm to learn more the next time he came.
On Gopurnima Day at about 11:30, in Srila Prabhupada's room in the Lotus building, there was about 5 other devotees got Brahman initiation as well. Padmalochan was one of them. Before going in to see Srila Prabhupada, I was thinking that this is my chance to ask Srila Prabhupada some questions. And underneath it I was thinking,